Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Ware of Stream English here, and today I'm going to be telling you about the key quotes in Remains. Now I've picked 5 quotes that I think are the 5 best at kind of conveying the key ideas and themes of this poem, but also are really rich, so there's a lot that you're going to be able to analyse as well. Now, just because these are the 5 I've picked doesn't mean that you shouldn't bother look at the rest of the poem. Okay, that would be a very bad teacher of me to say that, and I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that quote selection in an essay is everything. And when there's lots of different potential quotes to choose from, as there often is with poems, you want to make sure you're choosing poems that are really strong in conveying the themes and have a lot to analyse. So this video is going to help you check and make sure that the quotes you choose to talk about in an essay are ones like that. Oh, and don't forget, hit like and subscribe. Let's do this. The first line that I'm going to say is a key quote is the very first line of the poem. On another occasion, we got sent out. Now, there's a few different things we want to analyse here. First of all, the use of the adjective another. What that does is it confirms to us that this is like a common occurrence, and it makes it seem like, you know, it's very kind of everyday and all that kind of thing. And that is important in communicating something about war and telling us that with war, you can often experience really traumatic things, and it's really kind of normal and typical to go through these experiences. And that makes sense if we're thinking about this poem exploring like the PTSD that soldiers have experienced at war. It makes sense here because we're getting a sense of like they're repeatedly exposed to traumatic experiences. We also have quite a kind of casual tone here, very conversational tone, and that's something we get throughout the poem. Now, that's partly reflecting the fact that Simon Armitage was writing this poem based on conversations he'd had with real soldiers. And so it's got that conversational tone as if a soldier is telling a story, just as he experienced. But it's also part of communicating that sense of how like soldiers are desensitized to the violence, desensitized to the kind of trauma, because he uses and he keeps using throughout the poem such colloquial language, such a kind of relaxed tone to talk about something that for actually a lot of people would be incredibly emotional, incredibly difficult. And again, that's telling us something about war and what war does to soldiers and how it desensitizes them from the difficult things that they've experienced. We can also analyze that use of the plural pronoun of we, first person plural pronoun of we, and how that again just reminds us there's multiple people that experience this. And I think we can say that that's part of Armitage trying to really, from the very opening of the poem, hammer home the commonality of this experience. This is not some like one-off that one particular soldier experienced and nobody else does. The use of we really gets across that sense of collective experience that soldiers have. I also think the we is communicating another element of army life in the sense of like that closeness of members of the same unit and how they are like all in it together. They take part in the action of war together, but they also have that sense of responsibility for one another, accountability to one another. There is that closeness between them. So I think it's also creating that connection as well. He sees himself, the speaker of this poem sees himself as a we first. The I is what comes later. There's also something interesting in the use of the verb phrase got sent, right? So one of the things I really love about Remains is how it explores the power dynamics that exist in warfare, and that question of who really holds the power and if our speaker of the poem is powerful or powerless. And I think that this phrasing of got sent out is really interesting, suggesting a lack of power on the part of our soldier. He so often seems to be, as part of the army, the one in control. They are the ones who are going to shoot and kill the looter, and the looter is powerless. But there's also a sense here of they aren't in complete control, they have been commanded to do something. So I think that again is highlighting something about war in that really weird contrast that soldiers experience between being incredibly powerful and that they hold life and death in their hands and they have the capacity to kill, as we're going to see later with the looter, but also the powerlessness in the sense that they're following commands and they're doing what somebody else tells them to do. And I think that's a really kind of subtle but important dynamic of army life that's presented in that first line. So overall, we can see why this is a key quote. First of all, the fact that it's in the privileged position of being the very first line. This is like how Simon Armitage is really starting off communicating a lot of key ideas. And the key ideas we are getting a lot here is army life, military life, warfare, and what it's like being part of that. And we're getting so much just from that opening line that is also then continued throughout the rest of the poem as well. The next key quote in this poem is where we still have our soldier kind of before the Volta, where he seems like he's taking everything fine. But we do also start getting hints that he's not completely okay with what he did. And that is the line, "I see every round as it rips through his life." Now, on the one hand, we've still got the very colloquial language, we've still got the conversational tone that makes it feel as if the soldier is viewing this as not a particularly big deal. However, at the same time, we're still getting clues now that he's not dealing with this, or not so much that he's not dealing with it, but that it is affecting him, that he is recognizing the severity of his actions. So we get that, for example, with the description of it ripping through his life, the use of that dynamic verb rip, and how it has really violent, aggressive connotations. This is showing us that the speaker of this poem is aware of the kind of violence and aggression behind what he is doing. We also get that from the description, the adjective of it being every round. Now, the fact that the speaker can see every single bullet. Now, on the one hand, it might just be emphasizing, how many times he's being shot or something like that. But I also think it highlights how closely this soldier is paying attention to what's happening. He's really seeing every single impact that is being had on this person. So that could perhaps be starting to suggest how the events are having an impact on our soldier. He is really kind of closely paying attention to things. You've also got that description of it ripping through his life. Now that's a really interesting word choice there. Why his life, not his body? Now, on one level, the use of life could just be reminding us of the fatality of these actions, of the fact that it is life and death. He is killing someone. But I think there's more to it as well. If we think about the kind of connotations of life, it can represent everything you have done and everything you are. Okay, so like your personal life and everything you've experienced in life. And so I think by using this word life, more so than body, it reinforces again the severity of the actions, because it's suggesting the level of impact that is being had here. This isn't just against a body, which would be quite kind of like maybe suggesting the desensitized again, but it's through somebody's life that has a lot of meaning to it. It has a lot of importance in it, and it's being ripped through. So I feel like that juxtaposition between rips with its violence and its aggression, and also actually in a certain way the casualness to it as well. Like when you just, you usually rip objects, right? You rip paper or things like that, or you rip your dress or whatever. Like, it's really violent and aggressive, but also something we wouldn't normally associate with humans. It's something that you could also argue has a more casual tone to it still. That is then juxtaposed against life. This word that has connotations of being so important, so valuable, so kind of, long spanning. And it's like the juxtaposition between those two is really perhaps highlighting how aware our speaker is of the impact of his actions. The fact that he knows he is destroying someone, and that someone he is destroying had a kind of value to them, had an importance to them by being a human being. I also think it's interesting that the line starts with "I see." So he really puts this on him with the first person pronoun. He's really, in the past, we've had a sense of like the we and the myself and somebody else and somebody else. We've had a sense of like others being in it with him. This is this line here. I mean, technically the I swear just in the line before is the first time we have the first person pronoun being used, but this is still like part of that same topic that he's talking about, and this is the first time he's talking about just himself. And I think that's important because it's like when he's focusing on himself, suddenly we're getting to see him a little bit more outside of that casual collection of the army, and we're starting to see how these things maybe do affect him a bit more too. So overall, I would say that this quote is, number one, really important because it occurs before the Volta, but at the same time still hints at the kind of early beginnings of an impact, but at the same time also conveys that like more relaxed, casual tone, which is then used to talk about something really serious and aggressive and horrible, like killing somebody. So again, this is something I love about Remains by Simon Armitage, is so often there's really different interpretations you can have about the exact same line. And I think that's a deliberate thing by Armitage because he is really trying to highlight the really different, sides to the coin of warfare, how you can be so like relaxed of like, oh yeah, we got sent out to tackle looters, but at the same time what you're doing is killing people. And so I think that with this line, there's two really, really different ways of analysing it. On the one hand, it suggests he's very kind of casual about this really serious thing. On the other hand, it's suggesting he is starting to feel not so much guilt. We're not getting that yet. It's more just he's aware of the severity of his actions. And so the two happening at the same time, it's that weird kind of complication of warfare. So this is really interesting, again, with that effect that conflict has on soldiers, the really confusing, conflicting effect that it has on soldiers, and their awareness of the kind of power that they have too, with the ability to take someone's life. So my next key quote is the Volta of the poem. Now, the Volta is obviously really important in this poem because the whole point of it is exploring the consequences of war. And the consequences of war is the kind of PTSD, the struggle that soldiers have when they come back home. And that is what our Volta is key in exploring. Now, the Volta technically occurs at end of story, except not really. That's where we start to have the change. However, I think that it's important to examine more than that. The end of story, except not really, hasn't got masses to say about it. It's not that rich. From a structural standpoint, it's very important. From a language standpoint, I don't think it's as rich as the lines that come after it. So this is quite a long little chunk, but I would say this is a kind of key chunk altogether. So first of all, the end of story, except not really, is of course communicating on a simple literal level, the events have not ended. Okay, it's relatively straightforward, relatively explicit. We then get a sense in the next lines of why things haven't ended, because of course the reader doesn't know yet that it's because of the PTSD and the guilt. That's what they're about to find out. And so we can see how Armitage starts to feed that information to us. So we get it first of all with the blood shadow. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Now, first of all, the blood shadow. On a simple literal level, it's the stain of the blood that is on the street. But it's really interesting that use of the word shadow. I'm calling it a blood shadow as well. So the blood serves to remind us of the violence because of its connotations of violence and aggression. But then also shadow having its connotations of like following you, of something haunting you, of something that's always with you. Starting to give that suggestion there of feeling that guilt. We can also analyze how it says, I walk right over it. Now, the act of walking right over it, on the one hand, could be seen as like a symbolic power play, okay? Because he has the ability to walk over his actions. It's, the ability to walk over something often symbolizes, you're the one with the power, you're the one on top compared to the one that's down on the bottom. So on the one hand, we could say it highlights the kind of power of those at war, and that they can just kind of move on and keep existing in the spaces where they've committed violent acts in the name of warfare. On the other hand, though, I think when we then have that repetition with week after week, the tone of the poem shifts a little bit, and the tone starts to be less of a like casual conversational. I mean, it's still conversational, but certainly less casual now. That repetition week after week, as if our speaker is really trying to emphasize like how long he had to be around it. You know, there's much more of a tone of I guess of regret at this point, of feeling like he is always having to be reminded of what he's done. We then have that followed by the short sentence, then I'm home on leave. Now, of course, the military language on leave just means that our soldier has gotten to leave warfare, okay? So on a simple level, that sentence seems to serve as like an end to things, because of course it's like a short sentence, isn't it? And it's creating that caesura. That's where you have like a kind of final stop in the middle of a line. It's creating that pause in the middle of the line. It seems to create that end of story that he mentioned a couple lines earlier. Okay, it seems to create that finality. He's gone home. That chapter's ended. However, it is immediately followed with but I blink, and then the enjambment, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Now, what that does is really, really important if we think back to the end of story, except not really. The end of story is essentially, then I'm home on leave. The except not really, but I blink and he bursts again. So what we're getting here is the sense of the reason the story isn't over is because he can't forget it. And the enjambment there, such a clever use of enjambment in but I blink and he bursts again. It's like we're being pulled back into the moment that he's just come from in war. And the fact that it's on the exact same line as being home from leave, it's like there's no difference. There's no difference between being home on leave and being there in that moment of warfare for him. And there isn't an end. The two kind of can't get away from one another. So I think that those 4 lines there, again, you're not necessarily going to talk about all of this in an essay. You might want to just pick and choose some other bits depending on what your argument is. But I think that chunk is really, really important in communicating not only the Volta, but that this Volta is about how he's being haunted, how he's feeling the guilt now. He's really starting to feel the guilt of what he's done, and also really important in showing that PTSD, that consequence of war because of the fact that he's gone home on leave. 4th line I want to talk about is from this section of the poem where he's really struggling with the memories of war, and he says he's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. And I think that dug in behind enemy lines is a really important one to analyze there. So of course, first of all, the military language in it of dug in and enemy lines, he's using that military language even though he's back home. So that communicates that sense of like war hasn't left him. He's still very much, he's speaking in military language. He still very much feels that connection with his time in war there. But also the metaphor of the looter being dug in. So how that suggests that this memory is really deeply entrenched within him. He cannot get rid of it. How kind of strongly it stayed with him. And then also behind enemy lines. Now, this metaphor is all taking place in his head. So who's the enemy lines? Interesting. So what we've got here is this image of enemy lines creating a sense of like his own mind being against him, as if, we've already had the lines about him trying to like flush it out with drink and drugs and how that hasn't worked. So it's like there's a part of his brain that is working against him, and this memory of this looter is on that part of his brain. It's trapped behind those enemy lines. So it's really a metaphor that's capturing that struggle with PTSD where it is all internal. You are your own worst enemy because it's your own memory that's working against you. It could also just be a kind of sense of the fact that the looter is behind enemy lines. It could be a sense of that way of thinking about war coming through again. So the fact that his his feelings of guilt aren't necessarily in the sense of like, oh, I shouldn't have done this, this was a bad thing, this was an immoral thing, because he's still referring to the looter who's died as being behind enemy lines. Like, he's still viewing them as the enemy. So there's this kind of contrast perhaps between like the guilt that he feels that's suggested in the dug in behind enemy lines of his brain working against him and not letting him forget. But on the other hand, there's also the military language and how that, again, that sense of being desensitized, I guess, like he's still just viewing that person as the enemy and they're behind enemy lines. And it's all this kind of like military language being used almost euphemistically to talk about the emotions that he's really feeling. So yeah, it's, oh man, how great is this poem? Like, you have to tell me in the comments if you're liking it. I don't want to just be like nerd girling out over here about how much I'm enjoying talking about this and you're sitting there like, I don't know, I'd rather be watching Ninja Turtles. Right? Do people still watch Ninja Turtles? Is that a thing? I think I'm getting distracted. Let's go to the next quote. So the last line that we're going to look at is also the last line of the poem itself, because the last line is like always important, basically. It's, you know, it's the very last line of the poem. It's the poet's last chance to get across their meaning to you as their reader before you finish reading their poem. So they're really gonna put a lot of meaning into it, and that is absolutely true for Simon Armitage's Remains. And so of course that last line is his bloody life in my bloody hands, and the first thing that I want to talk about in it is the allusion to Macbeth. Now I'm going to give you just a little bit of an outline of the plot of Macbeth in case you haven't read the play before, so bear with me. If you already know the play, just bear with me a second. So in Macbeth, you've got a character called Macbeth, who is married to Lady Macbeth, and for reasons I'm not going to go into right now, they kill a king. And just after killing the king, Macbeth feels incredibly guilty. His hands are covered in blood because he was the one who committed the murder, and he talks about how like he feels he'll never be able to wash the blood off of his hands, and it's become a really famous metaphor for how we can feel guilt for the things that we've done. So on the one hand, we can see in this allusion that classic metaphorical idea of blood on your hands being like you have a responsibility here, and you can analyze that because hands symbolize your personal action that you've taken, and we really get a sense of the personal action here because of that possessive pronoun my hands. Our speaker is definitely taking that personal responsibility there. However, I think there's another allusion we can make, and in fact a closer parallel with Lady Macbeth and her storyline in Macbeth. Because Lady Macbeth, after killing the king, didn't feel any guilt whatsoever. When Macbeth was going on about not being able to wash the blood off his hands, she was basically like, get over it, mate, wash your hands, it'll go, calm down. However, by the end of the play, Lady Macbeth is the one who is like so racked with guilt that she's basically gone insane, and she stands there like she's like imagining blood on her hands as she stands there trying to constantly wash it out, and she can't wash it out, and in the end she kills herself over it because she can't handle the guilt of it all anymore. So I think there's bigger parallels going on here, that the original bloody hands line is said by Macbeth, but the parallels are more with Lady Macbeth with our speaker, because our speaker started off, you know, this is just part of war, this is just another occasion, this is not a big deal. Whereas now he's really feeling that guilt really, really intensely. And I think the reason that Armitage is creating that parallel to Lady Macbeth is because of the fact that Lady Macbeth commits suicide in Macbeth. It's really trying to hint at that real dark potential consequence of PTSD, which in reality is a genuine problem. Like, soldiers committing suicide because they have PTSD is a serious problem. And so it's trying to end on that really dark tone of, you know, this is a serious situation that can have fatal consequences for the soldiers involved as well. I think we've also got in there, linked to what I was saying before about like that taking that personal responsibility, as well as that coming through from the allusion in Bloody Hands. I think we've also got it from the parallelism in the line. Now, parallelism, in case you're not familiar with that technique, is where a writer uses like very similar grammar. And so what we've got in this line is possessive pronoun bloody noun in possessive pronoun bloody noun. So it kind of repeats the same grammar. And parallelism is always about showing the equality between things. So on the one hand, we could say, well, I guess there's a few different ways of interpreting what is there an equality between. The allusion to Macbeth with the bloody hands, it's creating that sense of like that direct responsibility. The bloody life is in his hands because he's directly responsible for ending it. I think it also kind of interestingly goes back to that like power dynamic that we've talked about before. You know, that whole question of who is in control here, who has the power here. And at the time of committing the act, it seemed like the looter was the one who was powerless and our soldier had all the power because they were the one like committing the act. But then since then, the way that he's being haunted by this memory, actually our looter has a lot of power because he can't get rid of him. You know, he's dug in behind the enemy lines. So his bloody life in my bloody hands, like that contrast, on the one hand, they're equal because of the parallelism. But on the other hand, the scale between life and hands, it's like the soldier is feeling like he's got way too much power. There's way too much power in his hands here. There's way too much that he has the ability to affect and control. And I think that's really interesting because in a weird way, he's feeling powerful, but almost in a bad way. It's like he's too powerful. He should not have the entire life of a person in his hands. And I think we can also get from all of this a real tone of just frustration, of anger, sadness, guilt. And that is again reinforced from the use of the word bloody. Because on a literal level, it's the blood that was literally created by the act of killing this looter. But also it's the taboo language, which is just a fancy way of saying swear words. It's the taboo language of the swear word in English of bloody, like, oh, bloody hell. And that kind of swearing, again, just gets across that anger. And what's significant about that tone is how different it is to what we had before. And that's the key thing with this line from like our very first line, is how much things have changed as the poem has gone on, how the tone has changed, how the soldier is responding to the events and how that has changed, how the PTSD has changed him. Really, really, really different. So you can also analyze just that huge contrast between opening line and last line. The reason I say opening line, you could of course contrast it to anything in that first chunk of the poem before the Volta, but the reason I think I'd go opening line versus last line is just because you would have already analysed the opening line, because that's also a key quote, but also the opposite ends, they're the exact opposite ends of the spectrum as well. So I think they provide a really nice like pattern to contrast there of first line versus last line. Overall then, from looking at this line, we can see just how Armitage has just put so much meaning into that very last line of his poem. Whereas the very first line of the poem was about conveying those themes of just what war is like, basically, wasn't it? It communicated that collectiveness of soldiers, the desensitization to violence, how common these experiences are. That was just like, this is war. This last line is about, this is the consequence of war. This is what we're left with after. It's looking at themes of guilt, it's looking at the PTSD, it's looking at the pain and suffering, the internal conflict. That's the thing, we've gone from looking at the external conflict to the internal conflict, right? Because we've gone from, this is what I did in a war, to this is how what I did in a war is haunting the hell out of me. And it's just, oh man, Simon Armitage, he's good. He's so good. So yeah, this final key quote is, I think, one of the best. It's probably my favourite line in the whole poem, because there's just so much there and really communicating the guilt and how much he regrets what he's done and the pain that he's feeling from having killed this looter.